I'm Alejandra and I'm a cloud developer advocate at Amazon Web Services. Welcome to the next episode of What the Cloud? If you watched the previous episode, you may remember that we talked about servers, virtual machines, and how to launch an Amazon EC2 instance. You may even remember that I mentioned that in the next episode, so today's episode, that we were going to talk about containers. So let's do that today. You're probably wondering, wait a minute, Alejandra, what the cloud is a container? In the last episode, we briefly mentioned that a container is a form of an operating system virtualization. I know, a mouthful. It packages up code and all its dependencies so that your application can run quickly and reliably from one computing environment to another. It packages code and all of its dependencies so that your application can run quickly and reliably from one computing environment to another. You may be wondering, why containers? Let's pretend that we have a developer writing source code and checking it in her source code repository. That's where you would store your code repository. Then it goes through a build environment. What this means is that your code is getting built and you are running your tests. Eventually, it's able to reach your test environment. We're able to verify that it all looks and is working as expected. Finally, you get to deploy it to a live, sometimes called production environment. One of the hardest parts, though, about this software development lifecycle, which is what we just discussed and drew here, is that all of these environments are going to be completely different. I know, crazy. Hey, have you ever heard someone say to you, hey, it worked fine on my machine? Yeah. Another variation of that includes, hey, it was working just fine in the test environment. I don't know what you did in production, but in test environment, it was working great. Okay, why do these things happen? Why do these problems happen? Okay, there are different problems that we're trying to solve for here. Some of these problems can be things like thinking about different application stacks, but today specifically we're thinking about other things like how do you run different kinds of applications across different kinds of environments? How do you migrate from one environment to another? How do you do that? So this is around the time when Docker comes in and goes, hey, I think I can help you with that. In each Docker container, you're going to have a runtime engine. A runtime engine is software that certain applications depend on to be able to run in the computer. So you're going to have a runtime engine, your code, and also dependencies. Dependencies, again, is when a piece of software relies on another piece of software. All of these things together that I just mentioned, together you can form a Docker image. Runtime engine, dependencies, and code, and you get a Docker image. Now, each Docker container is going to be the same. And this is different from what we were discussing earlier about the problems that come when we're trying to maintain different development environments. So are containers and virtual machines similar? Well, in a virtual machine, for example, you have your server and you have your hardware. Then you also have your host OS, so your operating system. And then each virtual machine is going to have its own guest OS, bins and libraries, and their application. And then the bins and the libraries are going to supply the software that the services need by the top layer apps. But in containers, it's a little bit different, okay? So in containers, you have your server, again, the host OS, but this time you have a Docker engine, okay? So a Docker engine, this is just Docker, which has just been installed already on your computer, on your machine, right? But notice how unlike virtual machines, a Docker engine is actually going to share the same OS, and your apps are instead going to be running on the top. Containers are going to be isolated, but they share the OS and appropriate bins and libraries as needed. Do you remember that in the previous episode, we explained how much waste happens when you duplicate a lot of OS? That's why containers are here, to help remove some of these redundancies, some of this waste, You just need one OS, and then all of your apps can be installed on the same OS. So in today's example for containers, we're talking about using Docker, for example, and we're also talking a little bit about how to create a Docker container, right? Well, if you want to create a Docker container, first you need to create a Docker file. And then inside of the Docker file, it looks kind of like this example that we have here. So this is an example of a Docker file for a Go application, how a Go application could look like, or maybe I should be pointing that way. So if you're writing a Docker file for a Go application, it could look kind of like this. Look how it starts already with from and your OS, and then you're using run commands to install all your code dependencies here. So what do you do with a Docker file? Well, it creates the container image, which you also use to run Docker build. And then you can run and test your container on an image with a Docker run. And we see some of these already here as well in the Docker file that I mentioned. So you can publish that image, and then it can be stored with all of the containers in the container registry, which would be, for example, with Amazon ECR, Amazon Container Registry, with a Docker push command. You can't store all of these images locally on your laptop, right? That's just too much space. So we need a container registry. And then finally, here we can see that this is where we have different tools to deploy our container images. Now, if you're wondering, what kind of offerings does Amazon AWS offer for containers? How do you manage containers with AWS? Well, when you have a lot of containers, one of the first challenges that you're going to run into is you have to figure out how to manage all of them, right? Okay. One way to do this is with Amazon ECS, that's Elastic Container Service, or EKS. And both of these can help orchestrate which virtual machine to manage or can take my container. With both ECS and EKS, you can host them both on EC2 instances, and then they can deploy the containers on EC2 instances. But then the question becomes, okay, who wants to be in charge of managing all of these EC2 instances? And the answer is you are. You're going to be in charge, right? If this is a solution that you picked. So this is where Fargate arrives. Fargate comes by and says, hey, I can deploy this container. I can do it. You don't have to worry about any of these EC2 instances that are running behind the scenes. I, Fargate, will take care of this, and I will deploy your container. So here we see that Fargate is serverless, and what I mean by that is it's serverless because you are not having to worry about managing the servers behind the scenes. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about what serverless is, but that'll be in the next episode. Today, that's all we really need to get into. But now we still have two questions. So do we want to use ECS or do we want to use EKS to manage our containers? Do we want to run our containers in our own self-managed EC2 instances? Or do we want to manage them and bother with servers? Do we not want to bother with servers? Would we rather have Fargate take care of all of that problem for us? Wow, so we have different options here, you know? You choose your orchestration tool, then you choose your launch type, and either way you go, if you want to go more serverless, not manage and worry about your servers behind the scenes, you can go with Fargate. If you're okay with managing all your EC2 instances and you prefer that, then you can go with EKS EC2. Really, as you can see with our drawing here, you have lots of options. Okay, so I know there was a lot to cover, but I hope that containers make a little bit more sense today than they did before. And hopefully the next time you hear words like Docker file or Amazon ECS, you'll be like, I know about that. I learned about that. Okay, so thank you for joining us today on our episode of What the Cloud. And if you stick around for the next episode, which will come out on Wednesday, we're going to actually hop onto the AWS Management Console, and we're going to show you how to create an ECS cluster, and I'll tell you what that has to do with containers on that episode. All right, I'll see you the next one. Bye.